from Africa with truth.
If you steal just $1, you're going to pay for it. That's how it started. No press conference, no warnings, just a quiet, sharp declaration. And within hours, Burkina Faso's entire political class was on edge. They'd heard speeches like this before. Every government says they'll fight corruption. But this time, something felt different. Because on that morning, government offices opened as usual, radios played, markets buzzed. But behind closed doors, the storm had already started. Unmarked vehicles pulled up outside luxury homes. Phone lines went dead. Social media exploded. No one was warned. That was the point. And at the center of it all, a former army captain, now the head of state, was holding the scalpel. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. So what really happened in Burkina Faso? And what does it mean when an entire system starts turning on itself? Stick around, hit that like button if you're with us so far, and let us know what you'd do if this happened in your country. And hey, don't forget to subscribe if stories like this matter to you. We've got more coming. It didn't unfold like a movie. It was quieter than that. But somehow that made it more terrifying. By mid-morning, sealed court warrants had been delivered. Military units weren't being sent to borders, but to ministries. Former finance directors, procurement officers, customs heads, all swept up one after another. Not a handful of scapegoats, but a whole slice of the system. Some had been untouchable for years, living well beyond their means, driving stay-toned vehicles to private events, building homes no civil salary could explain. This time they weren't warned. They were watched, for months. Inside a secured building in Ouagadougou, a small elite unit, reporting only to Traore, had been quietly building cases, not a bloated anti-corruption task force. This was a war room. They'd tracked embezzled funds, frozen suspicious transfers, and dug through private communications. By the time the arrests started, they weren't guessing. They knew. Across the capital, the mood flipped overnight. Businesses once favored by government contracts, canceled. Upscale restaurants that catered to officials, empty. Civil servants stopped answering blocked calls. Corruption hadn't just become illegal, it had become radioactive. And then came the broadcast. No uniform, no chest thumping. Just Traore, calm and direct in civilian clothes. He didn't name names, he didn't have to. Everyone watching knew exactly who he meant. His message. All stolen public funds will be recovered, no matter where they were taken or by whom. In under 24 hours, the shift was unmistakable. This wasn't reform, it was rupture. No more meetings, no more committees. This was enforcement, and it was ruthless. Most countries announce anti-corruption plans with banners, meetings, and bold words. Traore skipped all that. What he launched wasn't symbolic, it was surgical. At the center. A classified task force answering to no ministry, only to him. No leaks, no delays, no press coverage until it was done. They weren't just chasing rumors. They had documents, transactions, intercepted calls, and months of quiet surveillance. It wasn't random, it was mapped. This team didn't look like a watchdog committee. It looked like a military unit with data analysts instead of rifles, but just as precise. The mission was clear: track every stolen dollar, freeze every hidden account, break the network of shell companies and family-run fake contracts that had fueled the elite for decades. And it hit fast. Within days, the capital's social map cracked. Top-tier restaurants once filled with government loyalists were ghost towns. Phones rang, but no one answered. It was like corruption itself had gone into hiding. People started asking themselves, how long had they been watching? How much did they already know? That fear, quiet, contagious, spread faster than the arrests. And then came the moment no one expected. Traore appeared on national television, not in uniform, no theatrics, no firebrand speech. Just calm, just clear, just real. He spoke about betrayal, about money meant for hospitals that paid for villas, about roads that were never built. And then he made a promise. We will recover every public dollar, wherever it is whoever took it. No footnotes, no exceptions. For years, people in Burkina Faso had whispered the names of the untouchable. Now they watched those names lose their shields in real time. And if you think this purge was the story, stay with us. What came next wasn't punishment. It was policy with teeth. If you're finding this story worth watching, hit that like. And if you're wondering how far this goes, you're not alone. Let's keep going. While the headlines were still stuck on the arrests, something bigger was already moving offshore. Without warning, a national ban was issued. No current or former public official could hold foreign accounts. It wasn't a suggestion. It was law. And it wasn't just Burkina Faso's banks that got the call. International partners were quietly notified. Foreign embassies were pulled in. Cooperate or explain why you won't. Europe didn't blink, but it definitely flinched. In Luxembourg, an account tied to a former agriculture minister was locked. In Morocco, a $2 million transfer was intercepted mid-flight. Other assets in Ghana and Dubai? Flagged. For decades, stolen African wealth had disappeared behind polished doors in Geneva and Paris. But this time, the door opened from the inside. The reaction at home? Mixed. Some saw it as justice. Others called it political theater. But ordinary people, the ones who'd waited in hospital lines while their leaders flew private, felt something they hadn't in years. Alignment. The money that vanished while their lights stayed off. It was starting to reappear with names and receipts. Still, Traore wasn't chasing ghosts. He was closing gates. A second law hit harder than the first. No government employee could do business with the state, not through cousins. Not shell companies, not aliases. If you were on the public payroll, you couldn't profit from public money. And suddenly the room got quiet. For years, corruption hadn't looked like bribes in envelopes. It looked like overpriced contracts, phantom construction, a cousin's company winning every bid. Now that door was shut hard. You could feel the shift. People stopped bragging about who they knew in government. The hustle dried up. Even the silence started sounding different. But shutting the door wasn't enough. Because somewhere deep down, the country knew if the money got out once, it could get out again. That's why what came next wasn't about law. It was about exposure. When the third decree landed, it didn't explode. It bled. Every official, cabinet to local admin, was ordered to declare their assets, publicly. Not behind closed doors, not on dusty spreadsheets, on TV, in full view. The first to do it, Traore himself. Salary, savings, properties laid out with zero fanfare. And suddenly the silence turned loud. Some complied fast, others stalled. But across government, you could feel the discomfort. This wasn't about guilt. It was about exposure. In a system built on shadows, transparency felt like punishment. Civil servants who once bragged about getting theirs now fumbled over declarations. A few tried to fake it, until auditors started asking simple questions. Where did this villa come from? Why does a junior official own 3 imported cars? How does a wedding planner afford beachfront property? The answers weren't clever. The excuses stopped working, because this wasn't about catching someone lying, it was about daring them to tell the truth. And when they couldn't, the next step was automatic: charges for concealment, assumed illicit enrichment, assets seized. For years, these people had moved untouched through reforms that never reached them. Now a form they used to ignore had become a trap, and the public noticed. In a place where people used to joke that everyone steals, the mood changed. Conversations shifted. Street vendors debated asset declarations like football scores. Mistrust didn't vanish, but it started getting new direction. Still, Traore wasn't just counting what officials owned. He was watching how they reacted, because power doesn't panic when it's exposed. It panics when it realizes it's being outmaneuvered. And this was checkmate with a paper trail. After the asset declarations, the message was clear. Power wouldn't be protected by status anymore. But the question was, would anyone actually enforce this when it came to the real players? Most people assumed it would stop at the middle. That the top would walk, as always, they were wrong. Within days of the deadline, big names started to fall. A former minister, a senior advisor, even a cousin of a past president. One by one, they were photographed in courtroom hallways, not as guests, but defendants. These weren't stunts. They were trials, and the evidence? Tight, signed contracts, foreign wire transfers, ghost companies. Some tried to call it political. But the prosecutors came armed with facts and timing. One woman, once in charge of procurement, had funneled over 2 billion CFA francs through companies tied to her extended family. Her verdict came in under 72 hours. Convicted. Assets seized. No headlines softened the blow. Another high-ranking customs official, famous for throwing luxury parties on a civil salary, was found with duffel bags of public cash hidden under floorboards. The courtroom became the great equalizer, and outside those walls, something even more unexpected happened. People didn't just watch, they paid attention. Because in a country where justice had often meant speeches, they were now watching people bleed status in real time. The smirks disappeared. The shrugs turned to silence. This wasn't punishment for corruption. It was the performance of accountability meant to change public memory. And slowly it started to work. Trust doesn't return overnight. But when those once untouchable are forced to explain their lifestyle to a judge, the conversation at street level changes. If you've been following this far, ask yourself, where else in the world have we seen this happen? And if not, why not? If this makes you think, pass it on. These stories don't spread unless people like you keep them alive. Now enforcement had teeth, but what about prevention? That would be the next battle. Accountability had hit hard, but it wasn't enough. Because corruption doesn't wait to get caught, it adapts. So Traore's next move wasn't about arrests, it was about interception, in real time. Every major ministry was assigned a shadow unit, auditors with direct lines to the presidency. No committees, no red tape, no advance notice. They weren't there to report problems after the fact. They were there to stop the money from ever leaving. And they did. In one case, a deal worth millions was halted mid-signature after auditors flagged a fake supplier buried under 5 layers of company names. Before, that contract would have passed without a blink. Now it didn't make it past the first pen stroke. That kind of speed sent a message across departments. You're not working alone anymore. But it didn't stop there. Traore's government launched something more subtle, but just as sharp, an anonymous tip line backed by full legal protection. Civil servants could now report shady behavior inside their offices. No exposure, no retaliation. And some did. A junior finance clerk flagged a suspicious invoice. A low-level engineer questioned why equipment never arrived. They spoke, and for the first time, the system listened. This wasn't about building fear, it was about flipping it. Before, the fear was of speaking up. Now, the fear belonged to those who assumed no one ever would. In a country where silence had once been survival, people started looking over their shoulders for new reasons, not because of enemies. because the law might finally be watching. But if this was the wall around public funds, one question still remained. What about the wealth that already got out? Stopping future theft was one thing. Getting back what was already stolen, that was war. Traore quietly activated a financial recovery task force. No press release, no ceremony. Just a team of cyber analysts, forensic accountants, and international legal experts. Their mission? Track stolen public wealth across borders, seize it, bring it home. Not theory, action. One trail started with a missing school budget in Fata, ended with a condo on the French Riviera. Another linked fake medical equipment contracts to luxury shopping in Dubai. The money wasn't gone. It was just hiding in places no one had dared search. But now they did. Instead of going through traditional Western banks, often slow, political, or protective, Burkina Faso looked east. They worked with Turkey, the UAE, even Russia. Fewer lectures, more access, and it worked. A $600,000 account in Luxembourg, frozen. A $2 million transfer intercepted before it cleared Morocco. Luxury homes in Accra and Dakar. Flagged and tied to former officials. But this wasn't just about freezing funds. It was about showing people where their money had gone and where it was coming back. A public registry was launched. Citizens could log in and see what had been recovered, where it came from, and which ministry it was sent back to. Health, education, roads. For the first time, people didn't just hear that justice was being done. They could track it, line by line. Before, recovery was a myth. Now it was a number you could read off a screen. But as the numbers rose, so did something else: pressure. Not from within, from abroad. Banks started stalling. Visas got delayed. Quiet phone calls were made. Because for years, foreign institutions had profited from holding looted African wealth. Now they were being exposed. And Traore, he didn't flinch. "If they hide in glass towers," he said, "we'll shine a light so bright even their lawyers can't look away." But this fight, chasing dollars across oceans, was only half the story. Because the biggest leak wasn't offshore, it was right under their feet. While the world focused on frozen accounts, the real leak never left the country. It was being loaded onto trucks in broad daylight. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's top gold producers, but its villages still dark at night. Its clinics still short on medicine. That disconnect wasn't a mystery, it was design. So Traore did what few before him dared. He stopped everything. No new gold export licenses. All existing contracts paused for audit. Foreign mining companies, some with decades of access, were told to stand down. No fanfare, no warning, just silence, and then soldiers. Mining zones with shady ownership were seized. High-value sites were secured under military watch. Satellite surveillance tracked illegal routes. But it wasn't just about locking things down. It was about building something up. In the heart of the Sahel, construction began on the country's first state-owned gold refinery, locally run. Transparent contracts. No foreign hands with old ties. Gold would no longer leave unrefined, stripped of value before it even hit a port. Now Burkina Faso would refine it, price it, and keep the profit. This wasn't just policy. It was economic independence poured in concrete, and the people felt it. Villages once ignored began seeing school renovations. Jobs were created near mining zones. A share of revenue was earmarked for local development, real equity, not trickle-down promises. Still, resistance came fast. Former contract holders lobbied foreign governments. Reports branded the country unstable. Sanctions were whispered, but inside the country, something shifted. People who had watched trucks roll past their broken roads were now asking, why wasn't this done before? Gold hadn't just been a resource, It had been a mirror, a reminder of who was winning and who was watching. Now, for the first time in a generation, that mirror was facing the other way. And with that shift came one final question. I've covered a lot of stories in my time, some loud, some chaotic, most full of promises that never left paper. But this one felt different, because it wasn't just about arrests or speeches or new laws. It was about flipping the power dynamic, about a country saying, "We're not asking any more." In my opinion, what we're seeing in Burkina Faso isn't just reform. It's reclamation, reclaiming stolen wealth, reclaiming ground, reclaiming dignity. But here's the part that sticks with me. Justice, no matter how bold, is only as strong as the people willing to defend it when no one's watching. So what happens next? I don't know, but I'll be watching. And if you've made it this far, maybe you will too. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more coming. Stories that dig deeper, go quieter, and challenge what we think we know. And if you're curious about what happens after this, stick around. The next chapter's already loading.